There's a moment in World War II research that, well, hits every serious historian the same way. You're digging through declassified field notes or crawling through the margins of some forgotten engineering report, and suddenly you hit something so out of place, so uncomfortably effective, that it forces you to stop and rethink what you thought you understood about wartime innovation. That's exactly the case with a baffling underground shelter design built in scattered pockets across Eastern Europe and the Balkans during the final years of the war. It's a design that shouldn't have worked, not with the materials available, not with the time constraints, and certainly not under the collapsing logistical networks of 1944 and 1945. And yet these shelters survived bombardments that destroyed the modern houses sitting above them. What makes this topic worth your attention isn't just the mystery. It's the fact that these shelters were built by soldiers and civilians who had no advanced machinery, limited training, and only crude tools. Still, they produced something that, even today, leaves structural engineers staring at field measurements with the same expression you'd have after watching a tank climb a tree. The structure behaves like it's cheating gravity. It distributes shockwaves in a pattern that shouldn't occur naturally. And the most surprising part? The principles behind it are practical and usable today for survivalists, homesteaders, and anyone studying defensive engineering. So let's break this design open. No myths, no romanticism, just the real mechanics behind a World War II shelter system that shouldn't have worked but did, repeatedly, under some of the harshest bombardments of the war. The design looked primitive, but the physics working inside it were anything but. The shelters weren't uniform. They varied from region to region, but the core structure remained stubbornly consistent. Builders created a horseshoe-shaped cavity with a sloping back wall and a slightly raised front lip. The ceiling sat low, not by accident, but because the entire chamber was engineered to make blast pressure move the way water flows downhill. Engineers today, they often compare the internal volume of these shelters to a tuned acoustic chamber. When a shockwave hits a normal room, pressure spikes in milliseconds, rebounds, and basically tears the space apart. But in these World War II shelters, pressure didn't linger. It rolled. The geometry actually guided it into a circular path before the wave dissipated along soil channels, which were intentionally loosened and compacted in alternating layers during construction. What this really means is that the builders, partisans, rural civilians, and retreating soldiers were actually using soil density as a kind of pressure release system. They didn't have any scientific terminology for what they were doing, but they certainly understood how Earth behaved. They had watched mines collapse in predictable ways. They studied how trenches failed under indirect fire. They observed how barns slowly sunk into clay after decades of vibration. So their shelter design wasn't just luck, it was field wisdom, refined into a physical structure that acted in a way like a primitive shockwave converter. If you apply this lesson today, you get something quite valuable. Unconventional geometry can actually be more protective than brute thickness. Modern survivalists, often default to mass, more concrete, heavier walls, deeper pits. But those World War II builders used shape. A curved or angled space disperses force much faster than a square cavity. That's why, if you're crafting an earth-sheltered workshop, root cellar or storm bunker today, you really ought to think in arcs, slopes and uneven densities, rather than just rectangles. What makes the design even stranger is the supporting framework. The ceiling often used wood that really shouldn't have held up under heavy load. Young spruce, pine runoff, or even scavenged barn beams riddled with stress fractures. By modern engineering logic, these materials should honestly fail pretty quickly under compression. But the builders didn't rely on the wood for strength. They relied on a compression technique so old it actually predates written history, but so effective that you'll still see it in the most earthquake-resistant regions of the world. The beams weren't placed horizontally. Instead, they were laid in a shallow arch, wedged in place so tightly that every piece became part of a single pressure-sharing system. Even under bombardment, these beams didn't behave independently. They behaved like one solid object. If you've ever stacked firewood in alternating layers and noticed how the pile tightens as it settles, you've seen the principle at work. The shelter's arch generated internal pretension. The more external pressure the soil exerted, the more the structure locked itself together. Here's where a practical takeaway comes in. If you're constructing an off-grid shelter or storage space and only have access to, well, mediocre timber, don't dismiss it. When arranged in arch-based compression frameworks, even low-grade wood can outperform heavy beams laid flat. This trick turns weak material into a strong system, as long as it's wedged tightly, evenly spaced, and capped with compacted soil. Researchers examining surviving examples notice something almost supernatural. Even in winter conditions where the surface temperature dropped well below freezing, the interior stayed several degrees warmer than expected. Not comfortable, but survivable. This wasn't due to human body heat alone. It came from a thermal pocket created by soil moisture distribution intentionally managed during construction. Builders packed the lower half of the back wall with slightly damp soil while keeping the upper section dry. When cold air seeped in, the temperature differential forced the moisture to condense and release small bursts of latent heat, keeping the interior just above the danger threshold. This wasn't magic. It was a crude heat battery. But it was effective enough that some shelters sustained occupants for days during heavy shelling. If you're developing a modern earth shelter, consider a similar layered approach. A wall that alternates moisture levels can produce these microheating effects without the need for fuel. Now, it won't exactly warm a room, but it will slow heat loss enough to make a difference in an emergency. Really, it's a forgotten technique worth reviving. Another feature that, well, often confounds engineers is the ventilation. Many shelters had only a thumb-sized secondary airway leading up to the surface. Any smaller and honestly airflow should stall. Any larger and the shelter becomes acoustically porous, allowing pressure to slam inside. Yet these tiny ventilation shafts worked because they were positioned precisely where pressure gradients stabilized. Builders placed them right at the intersection where warm interior air met the colder soil, causing a natural upward draft without increasing blast vulnerability. Replicating this today is honestly surprisingly easy. In a survival shelter, you just place a narrow ventilation tube where two different temperatures naturally collide, maybe near a back corner where warm interior air gathers, or along a sloping ceiling where heat rises. The thing is, the narrower the tube, the lower the shock transfer, and the more you preserve the structural integrity of the shelter. What makes these Second World War shelters so compelling isn't the mystery, really. It's the reminder that field-tested knowledge often outperforms academic theory. Farmers, miners, carpenters and partisans created a structure that, honestly, modern engineers still struggle to model accurately. They achieved durability without steel, resilience without concrete, and thermal stability without fuel. And, they did it under threat, with absolutely no room for trial and error. For historians, this shelter stands as a testament to the ingenuity that emerges when people are cornered. For survivalists, it offers techniques, use of pressure-sharing geometry, layered soil density, moisture-driven thermal pockets, arch-based compression that can be replicated today with nothing but hand tools and patience. If you want more deep-cut wartime engineering mysteries and forgotten survival techniques like this one, make sure to subscribe to Forgotten Frontlines. Share this video with someone who appreciates serious history and help keep these rare insights alive.